Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm going to take you down a little rabbit hole into Stephen King's birth chart and some really interesting synchronicities that occurred in my life as an avid fan of his work, and then later as an astrologer, and some of the key moments of discovery that I had when I started making some of the connections between my love and interest in his work as a writer, what had really engaged me about his work, and some particular discoveries about his birth chart and some of the major archetypal themes of his fiction. There was a few specific moments where these discoveries occurred that were wildly synchronistic and interesting. I'm going to try to represent those to you today and show you some of the connections that I made between his chart and many of the books that I grew up loving. Of course, some of the films too. Many of his books have been reproduced into movies. So I hope that this will be interesting for you. This is also something, the connections with his chart, I've often used in classes and seminars I've taught over the years, all inspired by the synchronistic discoveries that I'm going to try to represent for you today. So anyway, I hope that this will be interesting. And before we get into it, as always, remember to like and subscribe. It really helps my work to grow and everything that we do to find support. We're seeing if we can get to 100,000 subscribers on the channel. This has been a really fun bonus kind of content to produce. You can find transcripts of any of these daily talks on the website, which is nightlightastrology.com. It's bonus weekend content, so no promotions for the day. I want to go ahead and get right into it. I have a number of little clips from an interview that Stephen King did at UMass, a university in Massachusetts. I'm going to show you a few clips from a Q&A session that he did for audience members about his life and career. And I also want to share with you some really interesting connections to books like Carrie and Misery and Firestarter and Pet Sematary and Cujo and It, Stand By Me, and how some of these stories actually contain recurring archetypal themes that resemble some of the most powerful placements in Stephen King's birth chart, and also how I made those connections myself as a curious astrologer who's also a big fan of his work. So again, I'll try to reproduce that for you today. But here's how things began. I want to present to you something of an astrological timeline for my my process of discovery with Stephen King, his chart, and some of his work. So I'm going to first put a chart up on the screen and take you back to the time that I made this initial astrological discovery, which then became a part of the way that I teach most of my, a number of classes that include his birth chart. So I'm going to take you back in time, and we're going to go to the last time that Jupiter was in the sign of Cancer. Feels appropriate that I be doing this again now. So Jupiter was in Cancer throughout 2013 and into 2014. And in particular, when Jupiter conjoined my sun in 2014, here, let me speed this up a little bit, the discovery was made. Now, Jupiter was crossing the sun in June of 2014. At that time, my parents were going through a divorce, and I found it just very peculiar that this would be happening while Jupiter was on my sun. Of course, Pluto was also on my moon. So Pluto on the moon seemed to correspond much better to the death of family, for example, at that moment than Jupiter on the sun. So I thought, oh, I wonder what Jupiter on the sun is about. And it was during that month of June, maybe out of nostalgia, that I decided to rewatch an old favorite movie of mine, which is the movie called Stand By Me. I'm going to show you a picture of this in case you've never seen this movie. Let me just pull up a little screenshot of the, here we go. This is a picture of the cover of the movie from, I think it must have been like the 80s or 90s. And so that June, as my parents were getting divorced, I rewatched this movie, Stand By Me. A childhood favorite of mine. I guess, like I said, I was feeling maybe nostalgic. This movie featuring like River Phoenix and Corey Felton, Kiefer Sutherland was in it, John Cusack was in it. It's about a group of boys, young boys, who go on something of an adventure, sneaking out to look for a classmate's dead body. There's a missing classmate. It's assumed that he might have gotten hit by a train along the train tracks. There's some of the young boys' older brothers who stumbled across the body. They overhear it, and now they're in a race against the older boys to get out and discover this boy's deceased body and maybe be local heroes. And it turns into this very deep and profound experience of initiation, really, from boyhood into young adulthood. The initiation is made through the journey that they take, as well as the process of facing or dealing with death and mortality. And for some reason, this movie felt to me, I don't know, well, my parents were going through a divorce, and I rewatched this movie. It hit me really, really hard. And remember, at this time, Jupiter in Cancer was also on my sun in Cancer. And I was thinking to myself as I was watching this, gosh, I knew this was written by Stephen King, and what a way that he has of capturing that loss of innocence, that sense of childhood having a dark side. And that I felt like at me, there was something of I mean, I'm an adult, but, and was in the process of planning my own wedding at the time, in fact. But there was something that felt so comforting about a Stephen King story that's really about the loss of innocence and that transition that children often go through, and the fact that children face darkness as a recurring theme in his work, right? I suddenly was like aware of this, like, oh my gosh, Stephen King's, I started reflecting on the fact that so many of Stephen King's greatest works capture the encounter that children have with darkness. So I started reflecting on this. And the loss of innocence and things like that. It's like a major theme of Stephen King's work. And so I thought at this time, I was 4 years into my professional astrology journey, and I decided to look up Stephen King's birth chart. And I want to show you what I found right away that was of immediate interest to me. What I found when I looked up his chart, and I have always worked with the Cancer rising chart. I know some people like the Leo chart. I think the Cancer rising is better myself, but whatever. At the end of the day, what was really interesting to me here, we've got the big circle out. What was really, really interesting to me was that I noticed right away, oh, Stephen King was born with Mars at the 24th degree of Cancer, the fallen Mars in Cancer. And I was born with the sun almost at the 24th degree of Cancer. And so there's synastry in our charts in terms of my sun is at the same degree as his Mars. And as a kid, I can tell you, I had watched every possible Stephen King movie that I could, sometimes behind my parents' back. I had read many of his books as a kid. As a young reader, I was constantly told there are more intelligent things to read than horror, but somehow his books just really, really spoke to me. I found them to be imaginative, thrilling, deep. I loved his writing style and pace and his characters. I was a big fan. And one of the things that sold me on early writing in my life, like I became a writer. I went to graduate school for creative writing. I wouldn't be an astrologer, honestly, if I hadn't gone through 2 master's degrees, a master and an MFA in creative writing, and somehow found astrology in that process. He was one of my earliest and most important influences when it came to becoming a writer myself. And here I discovered in June of 2014, while Jupiter was on that 23rd degree of Cancer sun in my chart, and I rewatched Stand By Me as my parents are going through a divorce, that, oh, lo and behold, Stephen King was born with the fallen Mars in Cancer right on my sun. Oh, there's a synastry there that was pretty fascinating. But then I started really doing a lot of deep reflection on Mars in Cancer. And it was at this time that I was just starting to study traditional astrology and learning about traditional dignity categories. In fact, I distinctly remember at this time writing some of my first early reflections about Mars in Cancer, because of the way that I was exploring Stephen King's Mars in Cancer and the resonance of that placement in many of his novels. I remember some people who were like following me being like, oh my God, are you becoming a traditional astrologer? That's so gross. And being, myself being like, this is amazing. I love this. I love learning about dignities and where they came from and why they exist. One of the things that I was reading about from people at the time that were starting to open my mind to traditional astrology, I was starting to get into the work from Project Hindsight, Chris Brennan, Demetra George, Jeffrey Cornelius. A whole world of traditional astrology was opening to me. One of the ways that I heard people describing Mars in the sign of Cancer was in terms of that troubling connection between the moon and Mars. Remember, Mars in the sign of Cancer is in the moon's temple, and in that temple is in its fall. The reason for this, as it was being explained to me, is that whereas the moon tries to join things together, you think of the moon, you think of the womb, you think of childhood, you think of mothers, you think of home and safety and connectivity. You think of all of those qualities of nurturance and devotion and care and soothing and mothering and healing that at a very basic level, we all need. We all recognize the need for. That we're vulnerable, that we need care and love and tenderness, that we need a feeling of safety, that we need a nest, we need a bedroom, and a lot of the Cancerian qualities are childlike insofar as they resemble the fragile part of our nature. Not that we're totally fragile all the time, but there is a fragile part of our nature that needs a safe place to sleep at night, needs a soft pillow to lay our heads on. And the breast of creation is Cancer. And so here we have this symbol of Mars, of cutting, of severing, of danger, of hostility, Mars is that which threatens the nest. It is the fox at the chicken coop, or it is the cutting of the umbilical cord at birth. It is the hard reality of things that threaten that basic level of security, safety, nurturance. And so as I was first starting to understand the dignity category, I was at the same time pondering the divorce of my family. Jupiter was on my sun in Cancer while Pluto was on the moon. And I was recognizing this connection between that transiting Jupiter and the placement of Mars in Stephen King's chart, which happened to be sitting on the sun in my own. So it was a pretty profound time of connection. I want to show you now a couple of clips from an interview, and then I want to show you just how that Mars in Cancer plays out in Stephen King's work so vividly. And again, a little bit about how that connection was made. I'm going to give you one other date that's really fascinating. All right. So by the way, I showed my kids Stand By Me very recently for the first time, as Jupiter's back in Cancer and was conjoined opposite my moon in Capricorn at the exact time. So 12 years later, the first time I've watched it since my parents' divorce, and I show my kids that movie as Jupiter's opposing that moon. I thought that was another interesting moment. And of course, it doesn't surprise me that I'm making this video while Jupiter's back in Cancer, coming up to my sun. Anyway, okay, so let me now show you some clips. These are from an interview that I found in the Creative Commons of YouTube, Stephen King at UMass. I'm going to show you a few different clips here, and hopefully they will be interesting. I'll comment on each of them as we go. All right, here's the first clip. These are from a lecture that he was giving to a group of students at UMass, and this was a question that had been asked to him about Carrie, his very first book, and the inspiration for writing Carrie.
As a student, I knew a couple of girls who were at the very bottom of the social pecking order.
Oops, I think it's my speed is turned up. Let me go back here. Okay.
Isn't this an amazing crowd? Give yourselves a hand while I think about that. As a student, I knew a couple of girls who were at the very bottom of the social pecking order. High school is probably the most savage social caste system that America has. You know, it's very divided, and popularity becomes very important, and it's very difficult for adolescents because they're not emotionally grounded yet. And these girls were the absolute bottom. And one of them later committed suicide. But I had a chance to watch that ostracism in progress. And then later, as a teacher, I saw the same thing from the other side of the desk. And those two things came together for me, along with a number of articles that I'd seen about the possibility that psychokinetic phenomena, if it existed, probably existed in teenagers and probably existed in disturbed teenage girls. And I thought this would make a terrific book, so I wrote it.
So there he is explaining Carrie. And I want to mention a few things here. One is that Mars in Cancer is very well represented in Carrie, his first novel ever. It's about a young girl who, as he said in this clip, I observed when he was in high school that this is this very savage place, high school, in terms of like a caste system that is absolutely brutal on people that are developing emotional self-sufficiency still. That's Mars in Cancer right there. The awareness of emotional underdogs, or developing young women or girls or boys in high school who are being brutalized by a kind of social ostracization and bullying and so forth. That very Mars in Cancer for him to be so keenly aware of that and to have observed that in his upbringing, and to have noted that there was a girl in his high school who took her own life, and he saw that as connected to a process of watching her just being so badly bullied. So just his awareness of those things and the connection that they have to, in Carrie, a young girl who at the time of her menstruation is being brutalized at school and develops these telekinetic powers or whatever. She can set things on fire, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I've seen that one. I was probably back in the 90s when I saw it. But anyway, very Mars in Cancer, his awareness of the savagery of what young kids go through, and a young girl at the time of her menstruation that develops this power and sort of exacts revenge, all like good kind of horror genre explorations of Mars in Cancer themes that he observed young girls going through in high school. I just want to note like how Mars in Cancer that is, right? Let me show you another clip. There's a few more I want to show you here. The next one is him explaining the background for his book, The Stand, which you guys may remember. Let's see here. Okay, so at this moment, there's a young person who gets up to ask a question, and it's a good question that leads him to talk about the background of his book, The Stand, which was turned into a TV miniseries, I believe, in 1994. All right, here we go.
One of your best writing moments, when you had your best idea and it just came to you?
Oh man, what a great question that is. There have been a lot of times, the thing is, I'm so lucky to be able to do this because, the thing is, like, there are certain people in life where everybody else says, we have to grow up. You stay a kid and play in the playground. You'll be our designated playground person, and you go play and we'll enjoy what it is that you do. The best idea, in some ways, this is terrible to say, but I was in Boulder, Colorado, and I was driving on the Boulder-Denver cutoff, Route 36. And I was listening to a radio station in Arvada. It was one of these Bible shouters. I love those guys. No, I do seriously love those guys. I love the cadence of them. It's a beautiful thing. And this guy was talking about some Old Testament book, and he's saying, once in every generation, the plague shall fall among them. And we were living near, a chemical warfare dump in that area, and there was a lot of talk about it. And I thought, what if there was a plague and it killed just about everybody? And there were only a few people left. And I thought to myself, I'm going to write that. And that was just such a blast. And it turned into The Stand.
I love what a just kind of a dark, twisted sense of humor he has. It's so I'm just tickled by it. But what I loved about that, first of all, was notice that it was a kid who asked the question, and then he acknowledges something about the validity of childhood. And for Stephen King, so many of his books include young protagonists, young children, young kids dealing with horrific things. And this is a part of a consistent theme in his work that corresponds very nicely to the placement of Mars in Cancer in his chart, where the realities that vulnerable people live with, children, and those who are somehow left out or marginalized. The consistent, by the way, Mars in Cancer concern, the concern of advocacy for the underdog, the concern with the realities of women, mother, children. Remember, Stephen King grew up in an impoverished single parent household with his mom. And the realities of growing up with a mom struggling mightily to put food on the table, and feeling like he was in a very vulnerable home and family situation. The darker realities of childhood is something that he has connected to those experiences as a theme in his writing. So here he is first really validating and acknowledging a young kid who's asking a question about his greatest writing moment. But then he goes on to talk about something that's also very Mars in Cancer. He says, yeah, I heard this thing on the radio. He starts talking about, first of all, how he's listening to a Bible thumper on the radio, like an evangelical, someone who's ranting and raving. And he says, no, I really like them. I like their cadence. It's so beautiful. Notice how he's clearly, he's not a born again Christian. Stephen King's very out in the open about his faith, and he's not certainly not that. But here he is able to appreciate a hell and brimstone preacher because of the poetic cadence of his voice and the language. That ability to appreciate darkness, that is a really special quality in his chart. I'll tell you more about where I think some of that comes from, because it is the Mars in Cancer, but it's also that he has a mutual reception between Jupiter and Mars in Cancer and Scorpio in each other's signs, that really adds to his ability to appreciate the darker elements of life and their reality in the human soul or psyche. Again, more on that in a minute, but I appreciate that in this example, he's also saying, look, there's a lot of talk about, this kind of catastrophic waste zone near his small town. And what if, so he's thinking about nuclear waste and in a small town, and what if a nuclear waste in a small town somehow got released and wiped out the entire population? There's Mars in Cancer again, right? What if in our small town, this waste facility that has some kind of toxins in it that everyone's talking about in this small town ended up coming out of our small town and wiping out the whole country? So that imagination of what is local, what is in the soil, what is in the home, what is in the community that could become disastrous, or that is dark and living in your neighborhood. That sense of the horrors of basic, everyday, local, village, town, family, home, childhood, huge exploration within the body of his work. I want to show you one last really cool thing. Comes in toward the end here. There's one last question that's asked, and it's very direct this time, which I appreciate, about kids. Let's see if I can bring it up. And it's about kids in his work. All right, here we go.
Hi, Stephen. My name's Maeve.
Yo.
How you doing? I grew up way out in Wyoming, and I actually moved out here to go to graduate school in Boston. It was a big move for me, but I actually felt comfortable moving to New England because I'd read all of your books, and I knew that it was okay in New England. I figured if Stephen King lives out here and everyone likes it out here, that it was okay to move this way. It's literally why I felt okay moving to Boston to come to school. So I did it, and I still live here.
Yeah, I'm a New England ambassador. Come up and get sucked by vampires.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
I do have a question. I first read my first book of yours when I was 11. I read It. And great book, great book. Yep. Scared the hell out of me, scared the hell out of my little brother, terrified my family that I was reading it, and then read the rest of your stuff. And but I felt a real connection to your young characters. And I noticed in all of your books that there's often a young character that's a protagonist that's a 11, 12, 13-year-old kid that takes charge and leads through the book and is the one that solves the mystery or takes charge and finds the talisman and brings it back and saves the day. And I've always wondered what it is about kids that you write so well, and what it is that draws you to writing them as your protagonists in your stories.
Well, with it, my kids were about that age when I wrote that book. And again, they're the best subjects for observation that you can possibly have. I watched them. I saw how they operated in the world. I checked out their friends, never in an intrusive way, I hope. But to try to be, sort of supportive and to listen to the talk. That, to me, that's like one of the most important things, is to listen to how people talk. And the other thing is that I had noticed as a reader that while there were books that were written for the so-called YA audience, young adult audience, and there were books written for kids, and those books were about kids, there were damn few books that were written for grown-ups about kids. But why not? I mean, that's a valid part of our life. It's the launching pad for everything else. And what I really wanted to do with it was to write about how kids have a wider bandwidth when it comes to perception and belief and the ability to accept things, and how when we become grown-ups, that field of vision starts to change and close down a little bit. And so what I really wanted to do in it was to try to create a bridge, fictional and make-believe and scary. But childhood is a scary time. And I wanted to give adult readers a chance to relive those years as much as possible. So that's what I did.
I love that. I wanted to give adults an experience to go back and relive the deeper elements of childhood, because there are books for kids, there's books for young adults, but there's no books for adults about being kids. That is Mars and Cancer. Precisely. Not just because of the theme of childhood, but because of the theme of exploring the darknesses, the vulnerabilities, and the depth of that specific time of life. That's the Mars and Cancer that's so unique in his work. Now, my purpose in showing you these interview clips is to really bring out that connection of Mars and Cancer. I'm going to do more of that in a second. But the first thing that I want to convey is just, this is to me so powerful. When you look at his chart, and one of the reasons I love Mars as in the first house, the Cancer rising version, some people will try to bump his ascendant into Leo. The 10th house, which is his career, ruled by that Mars and Cancer. The 5th house of creativity, ruled by that Mars and Cancer. The sense that there is something religious or spiritual or psychological that is of higher truth value to Stephen King found in these experiences can be shown by the fact that Jupiter, the sign of faith that rules his 9th house of spirituality, is in the 5th house of creativity in Scorpio, Mars's sign, with mutual reception to Mars and Cancer. So that he writes about the supernatural, that there are often tremendous intersections between faith, the dark sides of faith, the saving power of faith, the exorcising of demons through spiritual light, as well as the themes of exorcism in general and connections to demons and angels, the horrors and so forth. There's really a lot of Jupiter in Scorpio in his 5th house of creativity that comes through in his work as well. But to me, what was especially profound about this was, just that as, again, my parents are getting divorced, I'm revisiting Stand By Me as Jupiter's on my sun, and I make the connection to his Mars being on my sun. Like this is someone who's astrology somehow taps into my own. And isn't it interesting that in this June of 2014 space that I'm going back to being a child and sort of mourning the loss of family and of innocence, even as an adult, which is something that happens to adults, right? When you are an adult and your family falls apart, it's weird how you can almost regress to being a child. But what I found in Stephen King that June of 2014 was I had always had something of a mentor in my life as a writer, as a creative, for exploring those darker spaces. Now, I want to show you one more really interesting connection of synastry. There was one other very important time in my life when Stephen King's work had direct impact on me as a creative writer. I'm going to go back in time and show you this transit to that 24th degree of Cancer, 23rd, 24th degree of Cancer. And this was occurring in September of 2004. This was the first month that I started graduate school in creative writing in September of 2004, while Saturn was on my sun in Cancer in the 3rd house, would have been connecting to that 24th degree of Cancer in Stephen King's chart. And at this time, I read a book that he wrote called On Writing. This book on writing, I read at the very outset of going to graduate school for creative writing. On the recommendation of a professor when I entered graduate school, who said, well, who are your influences? And I said, well, I know he's not like the world's most canonical literary figure. He's a genre horror suspense writer, but Stephen King. And my professor said, no, that's nothing to, there's nothing to feel ashamed about having Stephen King as a literary hero. He is an incredibly good writer and has written, as I knew and as my professor, he's written a lot of stuff, you know, Rita Hayworth in the Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile, so many things that he's written that are not just genre horror. And, you know, not only that, but genre writing is, sometimes people look down their nose at genre writing, like fantasy or science fiction or mystery or whatever. My professor was like, we don't, in this program, you're not going to find us condescending toward genre literature. So I had quite a warm welcome into graduate school. And when I shared my initial love of Stephen King, he said, read On Writing, which is a book that he wrote about the craft and art of writing, which I started reading as I began graduate school and Saturn was on my sun. Not surprisingly, that was another key intersection point for me with the work of Stephen King. If you've ever read the book On Writing, it is absolutely phenomenal. And there are many places in that book in which he talks about some of the very things that I'm connecting here with children, with the vulnerable, with those Mars and Cancer themes. At that time, in 2004, I was not yet into astrology. In fact, it wouldn't be until the following spring that I drink ayahuasca for the first time. And then gradually things came into view. So what was really interesting was that in June of 2014, when Jupiter was on my sun, my parents were getting divorced, and I was watching Stand By Me and starting to put all of this together with Stephen King's chart and my own. I also went back in time and discovered, oh, look, Saturn was at the exact same place that Jupiter is right now when I started graduate school in creative writing and read his book that first month. So it's just meaningful synchronicities that have had such a strong role in my life as an astrologer. And students who have been in my programs will not be surprised that Stephen King's chart plays a role in almost all of my curriculum. Like every year, there's 4 years of curriculum at Nightlight. Every one of the programs, in one lesson or another, will feature an example coming from his chart. And this is where those contacts came for me. So what I want to do now is just drive home the point of how Mars and Cancer so many of his films are. Let's just go through it again. Stand By Me, a group of kids facing the realities of mortality and the death of a boy their own age. Very Mars and Cancer. I'm just going to go through. I'm going to show you a whole bunch. Here is, again, some of these are just like old school, and maybe you remember them, maybe you don't. For me, as really a child of the late 80s and 90s, Cujo. This is a family dog that if I remember correctly, he like eats a bat or gets bit by a bat or something like that, and then turns completely psychotic. But where the family cuddly dog becomes a dark reality. See how he's looking at something that is an established part of what feels safe and sweet about childhood, your family dog. But what happens when it turns psychotic? So those little plays within his genre to me are so reflective of the Mars in Cancer. Very similar story, and one that sort of repeats the same idea, but in a different context, is Pet Cemetery. You have a family pet that is again connected, the death of a beloved family pet that comes right at the center of a horror story where, you know, the pets are coming back from the dead to horrify. So Pet Cemetery, another example. Here's the childhood family pet that becomes a threat. Another one that we just mentioned in the interview that is maybe the most famous example is It. You may, if you never saw the movie or they redid it, I think I think there's been several versions of it. But here we have a killer clown and living in the sewers or whatever it was. This is an image of something that there's a lot of ambiguity around clowns. And many children are, find clowns very like funny and amusing, and there's a lightheartedness. And other children will have reactions that are very, like, some kids are really afraid of clowns. So what I find interesting is that Stephen King is playing on an image that for children has a lot of depth, and there's a lot of variety. There's a lot of fear in a thing that's supposed to be sweet and fun, in a thing that's supposed to be innocent and a sort of staple image of childhood and what amuses childs. And there's this bizarre connection between adults and children again, because the clown is almost always an adult, but taking on like a sort of absurd childlike form. In this case, it's a horrifying form. So again, like, and it's a big childhood adventure for the kids that acts as a kind of initiation into a spiritual reality of, good and evil. So these things recur. Of course, I want to reiterate this one, which is Carrie. So in Carrie, again, we have the young girl who's picked on and around the time of her menstruation, very Mars in Cancer, develops these sort of telekinetic powers and, exacts revenge on cruel, harassing classmates. So the connection with menstruation, with a young picked on girl, with a girl who becomes a source of great power, but she becomes very menacing. It's like that there's all of the Mars and Cancer themes. Again, very similar. Another story that has a similar theme is Firestarter. I don't know if you guys ever saw this one. This is Drew Barrymore when she was, just little, like E.T. age. But here's, again, this is a story about a young girl who basically is the victim of some kind of experiment that her parents went through and then passed on to her. And it gives her these sort of telekinetic powers, where she becomes like dangerous. So the exploration of a young child given great power becoming dangerous, those are exactly the kinds of juxtapositions that he is just so good at exploring throughout his work, and was one of the things that for me as a kid was so fascinating. Here is someone who is frequently bringing forth these dynamics that feel like my neighborhood. They feel like the family pet, the kid next door, the girl at school, the clown that I feel so ambiguous and weird about. He could tap into the kinds of things that are exist in the childhood, but that are equally compelling as they still exist in the psyche of the child that lives in us as adults. That's why adults and young people like myself would find his work so compelling, because there's something universal about that archetype, right? And again, here's another one that to me is just like, it just doesn't get more Mars in Cancer. You guys may remember the original movie. I read the book as well when I was a kid, but it was Misery. So this is, what is her name? Kathy Bates, something like that. Bates, I think. Anyway, there's a traveler whose car breaks down, if I remember correctly, and he's taken in by this sweet lady. But this sweet little old lady ends up being a terrorizing, fanatical, crazy torturer. So again, there's Mars in Cancer. I'm going to be your nurse. I'm going to be your caregiver. I'm this sweet little old lady who's going to take care of you because you were stranded and you got in an accident in your car, and I saved you and I brought you, and I'm going to nurse you. No, I'm going to torture you. So when the nurse, Mars in Cancer, becomes a dark, like torturing presence, see, that's it. It's all Mars in Cancer there. Such a driver for his work, the ruler of his 5th house of creativity, the ruler of his career house. If you take that, Cancer rising chart. So anyway, I have taught some of these things for many years in my classes, but I thought it would be fun to kind of draw out the Mars in Cancer placement in his chart. I think you could equally, you could do an equally valid and deep exploration of Jupiter and Scorpio ruling his 9th house in his 5th house of creativity with the mutual reception to Mars in Cancer. That's also, I think, adding a lot of spiritual, psychological, and philosophical depth to his work. But certainly just the straight up, I didn't even mention, actually, there's one more. Let's see if I can find it. Where is it? There's another one. I can't find the image, you guys. It was, oh, here it is. So this is the last one I'll show you. This one, the movie as a kid really scared the crap out of me. It was called Children of the Corn. And I was a kid, and I remember renting this and, not telling sneaking it, watching it because my parents wouldn't let me. It's about a group of kids that basically start a cult out in the corn and kill all of the adults. And so there again, the way in which children become killers. There's some of the repetition of those themes in The Shining as well, by the way. So, but then the theme of childhood innocence and innocence lost, like Hearts in Atlantis, just so many other pathways we could explore. But anyway, I hope you find this interesting today. And it also goes to show that, just because someone has a planet with a unique dignity, like Mars in its fall and Cancer in his 1st house, activated when he got hit by a van on the side of the road, active at times where he was almost killing himself from addiction and, drug use and terrible self-destructive behavior, growing up with an impoverished mother. So that Mars in Cancer, while it has delivered some difficult things that express along the similar symbolic lines, has also been representative of what the kind of unique creative insight that is at the heart of a lot of his work, clearly. So I hope that through the interview and drawing some of this out, I can show you how I made a connection to who, for me, has been one of my most important creative inspirations as a writer, at least. And so to celebrate that here with some of this has been really fun. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll have more bonus content to come as inspiration strikes. Bye.